Hi, this is Carl Skinner, and I've been asked to talk to you about using prescribed fire in the management of Ponderosa pine. And this is mostly based on work that I did with PSW at both the Black's Mountain Experimental Forest and the Goose Nest Adaptive Management Area. And one of the things when we're thinking about using fire is why would we want to use it in a particular place? What is it that we want to accomplish with fire? What is our purpose? Because we know that fire is something that is natural in ponderosa pine, a lot of people want to just stick fire in there, but it's a good idea to have particular things that you want to accomplish so that you can put together your prescriptions to achieve that. And some of the things we might want to accomplish are, say, fire hazard reduction or creating of fuel breaks. We might want to improve habitat for wildlife, cover, forage, etc. We could do range improvement in the understories. And something else we might want to do is we might have objectives in the area for restoration of what the stands would have historically looked like. And we may have conditions that we just want to maintain over time because the stands are in pretty good condition. So maintenance of desired conditions would be another purpose. In any case, we need to set clear goals, which are the desired condition we want to end up with, and objectives, which would be what we want to do with the current burn that we're planning to do. And what we need to think about here is what type of fire would help you to achieve your goals. And along with that, would fire alone help you to achieve your goals? You can see the stands that we're looking at here. The one on the left is pretty dense with a few old pines in it and mostly a lot of young conifers coming up, cedars and fir. And then you have heavy dead on the ground and understory. In the middle, you've got one, again, with a few old trees and mostly a lot of young trees coming up underneath and pretty dense. And then on the right, you see a very dense stand that is kind of hard to see the pines in there anymore. And so what kind of fire would help you work with this? And could you do it with fire alone? Let's take this stand, and you could potentially put fire in there, take some time with it, and achieve your results down the road. But this is what we ended up with 5 years after using fire alone in a stand like that. It was in the same project in the Black's Mountain Experimental Forest. And you can see that we're moving towards our objectives of thinning the stand and emphasizing pine, but we have a lot of fuel on the ground, and obviously we haven't met our objectives at this point. So we would need more than one burn if we're going to use fire alone. And then here's the same project in a place where we had thinned it first and then came in and followed with prescribed fire. And you can see we're pretty much where we want to be after one application of fire after using the thin. So it just depends on where you are and how you want to achieve your objectives as to how you may go about doing it. And here's some other stands. These are in slightly different conditions than what we were seeing before. The one on the left has the old pines in it and younger trees that haven't quite achieved a state that where fire wouldn't kill very many of them. It would kill a number of them here. Some of them will make it through. And you'd still end up creating a place where you end up with a lot of fuel on the ground afterwards. So one fire is probably not going to get you where you want to go. The one in the middle, the trees are still small enough that you could probably do most of what you want to do with a single burn. And then you'd have the stand back to a condition that you want. And then on the right, you see a stand that's in pretty much the condition that you want, and occasional burn in it would just help to maintain it in the condition that you're looking for. Now here, let's go back to the one that was a very dense stand. And this is before the burn, and then this is 5 years after, using just fire alone in there. And you can see that, yeah, we killed a number of the young firs that were in there, and it's not quite as dense as it was before, but look at all the fuel on the ground. So basically, it's going to take several burns to be able to to work with this if you're trying to use fire alone to achieve a pine-dominated stand again. So every one of the burns that you do in a situation like this would have different objectives for which fuels you would be trying to consume and what you would want to end up with. Now, the landscape context is important to think about as well, because it helps you to design how you're going to approach firing and other things that you have to consider when you want to put fire into the landscape. And here we are looking at a pine stand up on top of the ridge there that's a flat, broad ridge separated by these very steep slopes coming down into where the creeks are at the bottom. And this is actually the Beaver Creek Pinery is what we're looking at on the Lassen Forest. This is a place that the pine stand itself on the top would be fairly easy to work with, but there's it's not easy getting into it and working with it. So it's just one thing to think about. And then here what we have is conifer stands, a lot of pine in them that are down in the bottoms of the canyons with oak, mostly black oak and brewer's oak, mixed with other shrubs above it in the landscape. And so it would, here, oftentimes the oak stands will burn fairly easily before the conifers will, after following rains or whatever, because it takes longer for the conifer areas to dry out and such. And so those are considerations to be thinking about. And then in a landscape like this one, where it's very steep and rugged, you have the changing aspects and the mixture of other types of plants and communities and so forth that will burn in very different ways. And so it has to be considered as to how the conifer stands are likely going to burn compared to either the oak or the chaparral and that type of thing. And that could make it easier or harder depending upon timing of the year and using of the aspect differences and shading and such. And then you have landscapes like this, which is common in northeastern California, where they're very broad, not very complex, and they not very rugged landscapes. And it's one thing to realize that in a landscape like this, once your target areas are in a condition that they will burn, probably pretty much the whole landscape would burn, because there's not much to differentiate one place from another in it. And so it's just another thing to consider is the shaping of the landscape and how fire is likely to move through it. Now, season of burn is interesting to think about because it helps to determine what fuels are available for you, and also the sensitivity of the trees, how they're going to respond to fire. And so you can see in the upper left one there's a lot of green grass in it and other greenery in the understory that's there, but it's a pretty open stand. And not a lot of that would burn in the spring, depending upon the amount of needle cover and such, because it's already had a burn in the past. Whereas the other ones, say like the upper right, which is definitely fall, you see the grasses are dry, the needles are dry, everything is pretty dry in there, and so fire's going to carry through there pretty well. But because it's been burned before, there isn't a lot of fuel in it. And that's pretty much the same as the bottom one. It's the bottom one is looking at it in the summertime, which is when a lot of fires would have occurred in the past, and you can see the grasses are starting to dry and so forth. And so it just gives you a sense of what kind of fuels might be available. In the springtime, your larger fuels are not going to burn as readily as they would later in the year. And then you can put these two together, season of burn and landscape context, to take advantage of changes in slope aspect, where if you're near the upper parts of ridges where you're going to get more sun and drying as opposed to down in the canyon bottoms and so forth. And so just other things to think about and how to put fire into a landscape. That what size of areas are you considering that would be more like what the say the natural processes might have been, and how large the fires could be and easily controlled. Now here's prescribed conditions that we found successful, and there's fall burns at the Goosenest Adaptive Management Area and Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest. And the main thing to emphasize right off the bat is that we found that flame lengths 1 to 3 feet are usually what we would came up with as the best, giving us our best results. And usually somewhere actually 1 to 2 feet was good. And then if you went 3+ feet occasionally, it's not that much of a problem, but it isn't something that you might want to have go through the whole thing as the average condition. And basically all other factors that you use for your prescriptions need to be integrated in a way to produce the desired flame lengths. And whatever elements producing higher fire behavior should be countered with elements producing lower behavior. So in that regard, air temperature can be between 40 and 80 degrees, and relative humidity 20 to 60%, and basically adjusting those back and forth with each other. That say the lower temperatures, and then lower would go with lower relative humidity, and higher temperatures would go with higher humidity in order to try to adjust for flame lengths. Wind is good, not a lot that you can't deal with it, but some wind is good to dissipate heat and also to give a direction of where the fire is likely to be moving most of the time. And so some wind is better than no wind. Fuel moisture, dead fuels, we basically looked at 1 hour fuels less than 10%. 10-hour fuels were somewhere from 6 to 15%. 100-hour fuels, 8 to 15%. And 1,000-hour fuels were, depending upon time of the year, to be 10 to 14% or higher than 15. And it just depends also on how much of the different fuels you have as to where you might want. If you got a lot of fuel you're dealing with, you might want to be dealing with more of the higher percentages, whereas if it's lighter fuels, then you can go down lighter and not have as much damage to the trees. And live fuels, we found at the timing we were doing it, were generally less than 100%. Now, firing patterns. Again, flame length is the key. Firing pattern is always adjusted to achieve the desired flame length. And we've used all of these firing patterns in the same burn and adjusted as needed to achieve the desired flame lengths over the course of the day as temperatures change, as humidities change, and so forth. And so there's, head fires where you let the fire just move with the slope or the wind. Strip head fires where you basically work in such a way that the strips are just wide enough to be able to get the flame lengths you want, and then it runs into an area that's burned. Spot ignition is where you have conditions that you can actually just spot the fire through the project area, and it can move the fire through more quickly than either of the others with less work involved. Tree center spot firing is where you actually light the fire at the base of the trees as you're moving through, and then it burns away from the trees. And so it starts with less intensity adjacent to the trees and gains intensity in between. And it usually leads to less cambium damage and less crown damage. And then there's also the backing fire, that where things are such that the fire can actually move either back down the slope or backing against the breeze or wind that you have, and still achieve your objectives. And now here's an example of a backing fire, as you can see, moving against the general wind that's coming through. And then here's a strip head fire. And then here's an example of a spotting, where we just start spots of the fire as we move through, and then they burn together, and it, like I said, allows you to move the fire through more quickly. And then here's an example of tree-centered spot firing, where the fire starts near the base of the tree and then moves away, and when the flames come together from each of these spots, it's usually somewhere away from the trees, and so that's where the most intensity of the fire is, and yet it's not right up adjacent to the trees, and the heat also goes up through openings in the crowns more likely. Now, the other thing after you do the burning is important to see if you actually met your objectives. And so you come back in and see what kind of burn you had within a few days or week, and just see where you sit with it. And if you look at these, what you see is there's a lot of white ash. This is right after a burn. And you can see actually here in this photo, kind of a trough there. That was where a down log was that burned out, and a lot of white ash. So you can tell that there was some considerable amount of fuel consumed and some heat produced at least at ground level to have that kind of ash build up. And this is actually an area where we cut a lot of the small trees first, but left them in place on the ground and to consume them after the stand was thinned. And so that's what created so much of the white ash. And then this stand had few small trees left in it afterwards. It was mostly just needles and some logging slash after thinning, and it wasn't, as you can see, a very heavy thin. And so the fire moved through fairly quickly, and that's where a lot of that spot ignition was in there. And one thing to look for, too, is when do needles start to drop? And if the needles are dropping fairly rapidly after your burn, the scorched needles, then that's a good indication that the crowns are in pretty good shape and not damaged. And so where the needles start to drop from, you can tell is where the crowns are still alive. And if it just hangs on to kind of frozen needles for a while, then those branches are dead, and you can see how much of the crown is probably in that condition. And then here's another area that was just burned, and you can see there's actually green areas of the mahalamat, Cyanotus prostratus, down in here, and then fairly light burn around that. And that's one of the things that we've noticed, is that it has a tendency under prescribed conditions to often not burn. And it leaves unburned islands within the project area, and can be where actually seedlings can survive, and probably played a role under natural forests. And then come back a year or so later and see how things are doing, and you can see in each one of these images that these stands are in pretty good condition and look to be headed in the direction that we're interested in. And so the objectives are met. And if you look at the upper right, you can see where the scorch lines were, and that the crowns are pretty well intact. Same with the upper left, only they're a little farther away, so it's harder to see. And so in each of these burns, you can see we're well on the way towards our objectives. Now, 5 years post-burn, here's one that you can see is in pretty good condition. And I've showed you this one before. That's where we thinned and followed it with prescribed burn. And it's definitely headed where we want it to go. And then this is one that was a similar kind of stand that we didn't thin, and we are using fire only. And so after the burn, you can see there's a number of the pines and a few of the cedars have survived, but there's a lot of scorch in there, and a lot of the smaller trees have been killed. And if you come back 5 years later, this is what that stand ended up looking like. So you can see that we actually created quite a mess. Even though we're headed in the direction we want to go, it's going to take some time to get there, and probably a number of burns under very careful conditions to achieve our objectives without having thinned it first. And one other thing I wanted to mention is we've done a lot of burning in the evenings and at night. And sometimes when you are on the kind of the warm edge of your prescription, you're definitely in prescription, but you're kind of on the warm edge, and it's going to take a while during the day to actually move fire through. You can get a lot done at night, because once the sun starts to go down, temperatures will drop, your humidity starts to rise. And another thing that happens is that you get more consistency to the wind direction. Often is that during the day, what you have is a lot of shadows and openings with full sun, and this causes differentials in heating, and the winds will be shifting as the sun moves across the sky, and how the shadows shift and so forth. And so the winds aren't they're a little more fickle during the day oftentimes than they are at night. At night, things kind of settle down and become more consistent. And we found that we were able to actually get a lot done in the evening burns. It's not done as much these days because of cost considerations and that kind of stuff and overtime to be able to do that. But it's something to think about. So anyway, these are ideas of approaching prescribed burn, and I hope they will be useful for you. Thank you.